Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions and radio shows, this one being a live streaming session. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic, and we want to encourage you to provide us with as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. You can call or text us at 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. We are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public better understand what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and to encourage viewers and listeners to participate in both of these activities. With me today is my usual co-host, Mr. Qasim Sadiq, who is the project co-lead for the Northern Roadlink project. Good afternoon, Qasim. Busy day today, isn't it?
Good afternoon, Don. Yeah, that's the theme right now with the proposed tour on the horizon. Couple of busy days indeed.
Yes, there's a lot going on right now. There's definitely a lot going on right now on this project. And just to inform our viewers, in today's session, which is called Environmental Assessment Proposed Terms of Reference Part 1, we are going to discuss the components of the proposed tour, or at least some of the components, with the others being discussed in the next show. So we might as well get started, Qasim. We've got a lot to cover here, and maybe you can do a quick run through of what we're going to cover today.
So I think this afternoon we're back to the provincial process, the proposed tour. So let's start with where are we? The technical tour process flowchart. We'll review that. Then we'll talk about what is the proposed tour, the idea or the difference between the proposed tour and the draft tour that we've talked about in the past. Then we'll discuss the components of the proposed tour. So in today's session, we talk about the introduction, description of and rationale for alternatives, and we talk about the description of the project section. And lastly, as usual, we'll leave you with our contact information. If there's a question or a thought that that you want to share after the stream is done, please feel free to get in touch based on that.
Thanks for that, Qasim. And maybe before we go any further, let's do a bit of a high-level review of exactly where we are in the tour process. So if we can bring up slide number 3 on the screen, please. I will run through that. So back in May of 2021, we issued a notice of commencement of the environmental assessment terms of reference. And then we were very busy preparing a draft terms of reference, which was then submitted through a notice of draft tour for review in late fall, I guess it was late fall 2021. And then we went through a period of receiving comments and taking those comments, responding to those comments, and then incorporating any feedback or any amendments to the draft tour document. And we're just in the process now of finalizing that and the draft tour document to become the proposed tour document. So it is going to be submitted very shortly. We will know, I think, Qasim, probably in a couple of weeks by our next show, I think, exactly when that will be posted, won't we?
I think so, Don. I think we're just sort of finalizing the last few things within the proposed tour as we speak, and we would know a date by the next show, I anticipate. So I think at a high level we're looking at the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks, maybe at most, but I expect we'll have an exact date for our audience at the next show. So please stay tuned for that at the next show.
And once that proposed tour is posted and the review period opens up, we'll be incorporating any further comments as well to finalize that proposed tour for submission to the minister for a decision where the minister will either accept with changes, or reject the proposed tour. So maybe, Qasim, now let's move on to talking a bit about what the proposed tour actually is. If you could possibly go through that, I think that would really help our viewers.
That's a good place to start, Don. I think so as well. So, as a reminder to our audience, we spoke about this a number of months ago when we released the draft tour. But the environmental assessment terms of reference, or as we call it, the tour, it's a work plan for the environmental assessment in the provincial process. The federal process, as we've been talking about that for the past couple of weeks, that's a different process, impact assessment process, and the language, this terminology of TOR doesn't exist there. So the proposed TOR is effectively a revised version of the draft TOR, with the revisions basically coming from all the comments provided during the draft tour review period. Now, in our case, we've received a number of comments from Indigenous neighboring communities, from regulators, from different provincial ministries, and from the public. And we provide a response to those comments, and effectively that collective input that we get from communities, from members of the public, helps us change the draft tour, I think, into a significantly better document, collectively shaped. And that new document, revised document, updated document, is now called the proposed tour. So the proposed tour goes to the provincial regulator, which happens to be MECP, and they will make the proposed tour available for formal review and comment. During and after the prescribed review and comment period, we as the proponent respond to comments and incorporate that feedback into the proposed tour, then submit the proposed tour to MECP for a final ministerial decision. And Don, just as you said, the proposed tour, once it's on the minister's desk, the minister's decision can be to accept the proposed tour, to accept it with changes or amendments, or to reject the tour. So I think that's the next leg of the process, and about to commence shortly, I think.
That's correct, and there are many components to a proposed tour. So if we can switch to slide number 5. I can run through those components, and we won't cover all of them today. We're going to cover 3 of them today, 2 of the bigger components of the proposed tour. But let me just run through the actual components, because it's a pretty comprehensive document, detailed document. And so we lead off with the introduction section, and followed by a description of and rationale for alternatives. Then a detailed description of the project itself. We will talk a little bit about consultation engagement. And then a very important section is on Indigenous knowledge and how that will be collected and incorporated in the course of the environmental assessment. We'll talk about assessment methods. We'll talk about environmental effects assessment. Another important section is climate change assessment, more and more. Commitments and monitoring, looking at commitments of the project to either during construction or post-construction, to checking to make sure that the project is not having impacts greater than what might have been predicted. And then finally, flexibility to accommodate new circumstances, because things do change in the course of developing a project, and so the document has to state how it will adapt to such situations. So, Qasim, let's maybe have a look at the first key component, of the proposed tour, and that's the introduction section.
It
That's
certainly
slide
is.
number 6.
That's the first section of the proposed tour. And unlike a typical introduction, which only talks about the project, this is a slightly interesting, I think, intro, because it starts with an explanation of the purpose of the document in the context of the regulatory process. So I know we're talking about the project directly, but this isn't a process that all members of the public, ministries not directly involved in the regulatory process, or neighboring indigenous communities review on a regular basis. So it starts with an explanation of the purpose of the document within the context of the regulatory process in which it exists. Then it states the understanding of the project. What the project is, what is the nature and purpose of the project, and then identification of the proponent. In this case, the joint proponents of Martin Falls First Nation and Webekwe First Nation. It talks about the background and context of the project. The major projects like the Northern Road Link, when by the time they get to an assessment process, an environmental assessment process, many different stakeholders have had opportunities of thinking about it in different shapes and formats. So some might have commissioned background studies. There might have been some policy level work done by governments. So all of that becomes the background and context for the project. And when you start, you put them on a table and you try to see what was done in the past, and that sort of gives you a lot of context for what should be done in the future. Then it talks about the purpose of and rationale for the project. It talks about the purpose of the environmental assessment process itself. So a little introspection there. And then the regulatory framework, the EAIA sits within, and as well as the anticipated permits required once the environmental assessment is complete. Of course, this proposed store is a public document. It will, for example, be available directly on the Northern Road Link website once it is released. And we'll give you that release date on the next streaming session. And it's going to be a public document on.
Awesome. I noticed that was a good technique there. I'm sure many of our viewers can't wait to find out what's going to happen in 2 weeks. Thank you for that. And that, as you mentioned, that introduction section really sets the scene for the reader to understand uh, just all the sort of the context of the project. So it's a very helpful section, and the way the sections are ordered really, I think, helps sort of lead the reader into and help them better understand the project. So that, and then for decision makers as well too, because they have to evaluate what it is that they're reading as well. The next section of the proposed tour is the description of and rationale for alternatives. And then this is divided into two parts. And the part I'm going to talk about is the alternatives to part. So let's talk a little bit about that. So in our case, one alternative to that always exists for every project is what we call the do nothing alternative. So that's where there would be no project. So the status quo, the way things are now. So this serves as sort of a benchmark against which other alternatives can be actually compared, not prepared, but compared. So that is always there, the do nothing alternative. Now, in our particular case for this project, there were no other alternatives to other than the do nothing alternative being assessed, because other alternatives too were discussed and assessed as part of previous studies. There were a number, I think Qasim touched on these, there were a number of previous studies that looked at various alternatives too. And so because that work had been done previously, we're only focusing on the do nothing when it comes to alternatives too. So Qasim, maybe you can go through another key part of the alternative section, and that's the alternative methods section.
And that's right, Don. You talked about alternatives too, and right next to that is this section that talks about alternative methods. Now, alternative methods, unlike alternatives two section, this one's focused on the different ways in which the road, for example, this one's a road, the road under question, the different ways in which that road can be built. Now, when you zoom out, at the end of the day, a road's a road's a road. But when you zoom in, you start to sort of realize that there are so many different moving parts to building a road, starting with the different alternative road corridors that can help connect point A to point B, alternative sites for temporary and permanent aggregate extraction pits, which are required for the construction of the road as well as its maintenance, production facilities of said aggregate. Then you need access roads for construction and operation because you want to access those construction operation facilities like aggregate sites. Alternative sites for supportive infrastructure. As you construct, you need temporary laydown facilities, you need storage areas, you need to build construction camps, and those might require and likely will require access roads as well. Then you've got different ways of crossing waterways. So it contemplates different watercourse crossing structure types, such as culverts, bridges. What would be a potential span length? What would be the life cycle of such structures? Then it looks at construction staging methods at water body crossings, looks at the hydrological and aquatic environment around the construction site, as well as long-term maintenance of a piece of infrastructure like this. Then it looks at road attributes, including the foundation, the road bed foundation, the horizontal alignment, which is the length and curves within the road, the vertical alignments, or how steep the road gets, the elevation and profile of the road. All of these speak to the safety and drivability of the road. Adjustments to the cross section and the right of way width of the corridor. Now, that's the right of way is the corridor that will be cleared to develop the road. So, all of those have different permutations and combinations, and those are discussed in the alternative methods. Then construction timing. There's probably seasonality associated with a lot of the work which goes on, especially for the Northern Road Link, given the climate in the far north. And staging along the right of way to facilitate construction. Since we have an interest in minimizing, and we want to minimize potential effects on the natural environment, and particularly on indigenous land and resource use. We are effectively, at the end of the day, an indigenous proponent, and that's one of the first lenses we're provided, one of the first sets of directions we're provided from Martin Falls and Webequay to be not just mindful, but to put traditional indigenous land and resource use at the forefront. So, for example, just right now, as we speak, the traditional spring hunt is about to start while we're conducting baseline studies. So we will avoid those areas so people can go out on the land and conduct the seasonal hunt. Probably not next week, given the amount of snow on the ground, I hear, Don.
That's right, Qasim. And in terms of alternative methods, we also look at we develop some background, don't we, with looking at previous
Yeah,
studies.
absolutely. You've got the background that I briefly touched on. You look at previous studies that have contributed to the routing of corridors for the project. There's been some level of thought that's gone into the development of a project, not just by one entity, but typically by different stakeholders. That could be industry, governments looking at policy, and communities and municipalities. So all of that thinking comes together when you bring those background reports to the table. You look at the evolution of the alternatives. from initial corridor alternatives to preliminary corridor alternatives taken forward for the environmental assessment. So you might start with a number, a really large and sort of at times mind-boggling number of alternatives, which is not possible to carry forward into every stage of the process. So you've got to start thinking about which ones work and which ones, just for a number of reasons, myriad different reasons, will not work, and you sort of proceed with those alternatives that feel more feasible within the environmental assessment process.
Thanks for that, Qasim. And let's move now to another key section, very important section that contains typically a lot of detail, and that's the description of the project section. And the first part I'm going to talk about is is sort of a shorter section, but it's an important section, and that's the geographic setting. So describing where the project is, and also where, and this is applicable to this particular project, where it sits in the context of other projects. So in our case, we have on either end of the road, we have two other all-season road projects that are currently under environmental assessments or impact assessments. So this section is very important because the reader needs to understand exactly where the project sits as they move through the document and are reviewing the technical work that's planned, because it's relevant to the area where the project is going to sit. Qasim, maybe you could talk a bit now about the next part of the description of the project section that has a lot of detail in it, and that's design considerations and criteria.
So the design considerations and criteria section, talks about all the different elements which would be included in the road design, and those include the structure types, span length, life cycle of an asset, and construction staging methods at water body crossings. And that's pretty important because construction at for a project like this can have a footprint which is very different from the footprint of the project itself. So that has to be defined and described. Road attributes, like we just discussed, including horizontal alignment, which is sort of the straight sections of the road, but also the curves within the road. And you want those curves to be as smooth and as drivable as possible from a safety perspective. And then you've got the vertical alignment that our engineering team has to think about, and that's the elevation and slopes and profile of the road. You don't want extremely steep slopes on a road. You want them to be as even as they can be. So those considerations come into play. Adjustment to the cross section and right of way width of the corridor. Now, this right of way width, again, that idea of the land being cleared, which is used for the construction of the road. So you clear a bit more land than you build the road on, because you've got the shoulders, you've got the infrastructure that goes along with it, and together that comprises the right of way you typically clear for a corridor. Then you've got alternative sites for supportive infrastructure. And there's a lot of supportive infrastructure that initially comes into play: temporary laydown and storage areas, construction camps for the crew working on the project, including access roads to these areas. So just like any construction project that you undertake, the construction activity itself has a footprint. So that has to be designed and described for a project of this scale. Alternative sites for temporary or permanent aggregate extraction pits, as well as their production facilities needed for construction, as well as for long run operation of the road. They need to be described. They're typically a little farther away from the road itself. So you need to describe where the access roads go, construction timing, if there's seasonality, and staging along the right of way has to be described in order to minimize potential effects on the natural environment and the traditional indigenous land and resource uses I just spoke about a minute ago. Very, very sort of important, I would say critical for our project. Then there's the idea of annual average daily traffic volumes, which is basically a somewhat fancy way of saying the average number of cars on the road each day. And if you have a high average daily, then you want the road to be able to withstand that wear and tear. So you build it to a different design criteria. But if you don't expect that level of average daily traffic, then you design it to a different design criteria because you don't expect the same level of wear and tear. Then you've got this idea of a design speed versus posted speed. You look at what would be the posted speed for the general public to follow on this road. And it would probably be, let's say, around 80 kilometers an hour, but you design a little bit of variance in there so that that safety buffer is built in. So if it's 80 posted, it would be designed at a slightly higher standard as well. Then road surface type, would it be paved or would it just be a gravel road? And believe it or not, there are some really good reasons to leave it as a gravel road only. That might be more desirable. So, that is considered. Design flow for ditches and culverts, the culvert diameters that go over water crossings and water bodies, road elevation and profile. These are all the different, very different and very significant things that are considered by the engineering team, Don in the background. While we just get to talk about it, some people get to spend a lot of time thinking through these significant engineering issues.
It's very true, Qasim. The next part of the description of the project section is, and if we can shift to slide number 12, please, is project components and related activities. So we touched on these a little bit earlier, but some of the project components or attributes of the project would be the length of the road, the right-of-way width, the cleared area, the actual road width, including the shoulders or ditches, uh, water crossings, including bridges and culverts, um, culverts that are being used for what we call flow connectivity to continue to allow the easy flow of water across or under the road, and then culverts used for water level balancing, such as in muskeg areas where you have a slow moving body of water, but with a road going across it, you need to have areas so the water can release and not build up or accumulate on one side of the road and potentially flood the road. Uh, and of course, as we talked about before, there's ancillary structures, meaning supporting infrastructure associated with the road. A road is not just a road, and these would include borrow areas, areas where that you would excavate material and use that to build up the road or to do slope stabilization along the roads. Aggregate pits and quarries, temporary access roads or temporary water crossings along those access roads, as well as laydown areas and construction camps. So there's a lot of project components, and these have to be detailed to the extent that they can be as part of the proposed terms of reference. And maybe, Qasim, you can tell us a little bit before we wrap up about the next section, project activities and schedule. That's slide 13. Oh, I think we may have lost Qasim there.
Sorry,
So
Don,
I
can
will
you hear
go.
me now?
Oh, there he is. Oh, there he is.
Yep. So as I was just saying clearly just to myself for a second there, but this part of the proposed tour describes project activities different during different phases of the project. So for the Northern Road Link, it's construction and the operations phase. We don't foresee closure as part of this project because it's intended to be sort of a perpetual asset, a part of infrastructure asset in northwestern Ontario. So the construction part would describe road construction, construction of supportive infrastructure, but also, interestingly and importantly, emissions, discharges, and waste, because construction has its own level of emission, discharge, and waste, which won't exist once construction is done. And then when you get to the operations phase, we get to describe road operation and maintenance. Again, within that, where operations to maintain the road are described, emissions, discharges, and waste, which is associated just with operations, is described as well. And then at this stage, we describe a high level project schedule. And it's high level just because very granular information just isn't available right now. It becomes available as we proceed in the environmental assessment process. More information becomes available, and we're just able to talk about that schedule at a more detailed, more granular level. So at this stage, Don, it's high level because that's all the information available.
Well, that was a lot of information in a short period of time, as always, Qasim, and that wraps up today's discussion. And thank you, as always, Qasim, for sharing your thoughts and in this first part of a two-part presentation on the proposed tour. I hope our viewers and listeners are beginning to have a clear idea of what exactly is in the proposed tour document. And we encourage you to join us again in 2 weeks when we continue our discussion of the contents of the proposed tour and maybe give you some extra information that we've been teasing at during the presentation. Don't forget to visit our website at northernroadlink.ca or follow us on social media via NRL Roadlink. Miigwech, and see you again in 2 weeks.
Pleasure as always. Thanks.